Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. Today, we're going to be answering the question through story, what happens when you are adopted, when you're given up for adoption by a Mormon parent and you are adopted by faithful Mormon parents, and then you experience faith issues. How does that all work out? It's a really, really compelling story. Margie and I are in love with this story. And we haven't covered adoption much in Mormon context on Mormon Stories Podcast before. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So hang on to the edge of your seats for a really cool story. We are joined today in studio by Andrew Fish. Hey, Andrew.
Hey, John.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being willing to tell your story.
Yeah, excited to do it. A little nervous, but excited.
And if that weren't enough, we also have Margie DeLynn in studio. Hey, Margie.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us.
Yes, absolutely.
You ready for this?
Yeah.
Margie?
Oh, and also me.
We are both
I
ready
feel like
for
I have
this.
less, but yes, I am ready.
All right. All right, Andrew. So before we begin, we usually have people kind of share their intention. I guess I'll just say this really quickly. The way that we exist on Mormon Stories primarily is through donations. So we're always grateful for those who donate regularly to keep us in business. But we also really rely on your support to keep the lights on. So if you value our content and you want to see it continue, the way that this stuff continues is by going to mormonstories.org, clicking on the donate button and becoming a monthly donor. If you'll notice, we don't run ads on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts. YouTube does run ads, but if you just buy the $10 a month YouTube premium, you won't get ads there either. So we try to keep Mormon Stories, we keep Mormon Stories sponsorship free and ad free, so that you don't have the interruptions. But the only way we can do that is if y'all donate. It's also super helpful to subscribe on YouTube and in all the channels and like and share this stuff. So, all right. So without any further ado, Andrew Fish, we often start with intentions. So is there anything you want to say about why you wanted to share your story today?
Yeah. I guess adoption has always been, it's always felt very central to my story. Just my story of growing up. It was something that was always treated like something that was really special and unique and
even miraculous, right?
Yeah. And what I found was that as I had some challenges with my faith, adoption felt pretty central to that, and so. I guess I can think of maybe a couple of people that I've met throughout my life who were Mormon and adopted. But I've never really had a chance to talk to someone who had any kind of faith, faith struggles, who was also adopted. And so I guess my hope would be that in sharing that story that, anyone who is adopted, who is having any kind of a faith crisis might just feel a little bit less alone and, have something to relate to.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
All right. Well, where does your Mormon adoption story begin? And my sense is it begins before your birth.
It does. Began well before my birth. But I'll start with my adoptive parents, which I'm just going to refer to them as my mom and dad because they're my mom and dad. So my mom was, she's the daughter of a Methodist preacher. Both my parents grew up in Florida, and she got baptized when she was, I think, about 18. She'd met a recently returned missionary, and they went on some dates, and then shortly after that she got baptized. The way that she met my dad. So she was, I guess they were living in the Hollywood, Florida stake. If anybody didn't know, there's a Hollywood, Florida. And so there had been some changes in stake boundaries, which she ended up moving to a different ward than she'd previously been in. And like her, I think maybe second week in that ward, she got asked to speak by the bishop. And so she's like giving this talk on the front row. There were a bunch of young men and missionaries, and she kind of noticed, like, as she's speaking, they're kind of like snickering and like kind of like whispering to each other. And so she was like kind of feeling a little bit offended by that. And so afterwards, this one of those young men on the front row approached her and asked her, well, basically invited her to go to some kind of a young single adult activity later that week. And she later found out that his brother was still in that same ward, but this guy who turned out to be my dad had been moved to a different ward. And so his brother had heard that there was like a new girl there that was going to be speaking. And so he told my dad, like, maybe you should, come and check her out. So he did. And then I guess the kind of whispering and snickering on the front row was like the missionaries daring him to ask her out. So he did. And they, after dating for a couple of months, both came to feel like they were meant to be together. And in 1975, ended up getting married. So she had been, I think by that point, she'd been a member over a year, but they also wanted, I think it was important to her in particular that her dad marry them because, he's a Methodist preacher. And so they, became one of the many people who didn't immediately get married in the temple that then had to wait for a year. And I just remember, her describing that as being kind of like a scary, a little bit of an excruciating period. Just worried that like something might happen or, one of them might die.
And they're not sealed.
Yeah, and then they're not sealed. And so, but one of the things that I always thought was really interesting, and I remember her telling me that, or her describing that when her dad was marrying them, so I guess typically in those weddings, they, and till death do you part, and he said for time and all eternity, which, because he knew that was kind of one of the, fundamental tenets of Mormonism. And so
in their civil ceremony.
Yeah, in their civil ceremony, the Methodist preacher was
He's not allowed to say that.
Yeah, I mean,
he doesn't have the authority.
He didn't know that he didn't quite have the authority, but I've always just thought that was like a really sweet gesture on his part. So they got married, and at that time, I think my dad was in mortuary school and ended up working in a mortuary, and then did that for a couple of years, and then they decided to move to. They ended up moving to Spanish Fork to just kind of be in the promised land. So, but backtracking a little bit, a year after they got married, they were married in the Washington D.C. temple, and then following that, moved to Utah. So once they moved here, my dad, so after a time, my dad decided to go back to school full time, went to BYU, he wanted to become an engineer. And so he was working, went back to school full time, was working part-time for a foundry in Spanish Fork, which, and then my mom had a job with the Provo School District. And over time, they'd kind of realized that for whatever reason, they weren't able to have kids. I don't know that right when they got married, they immediately were intending to do that. But, by the time like a couple of years had gone by, they were very much wanting to start a family. And in fact, my mom, she always kind of described like the only thing she ever wanted to be was a mom. And, like when she was in high school, like she didn't really have ambitions to have a career. She just, she wanted to have kids, wanted to be a mom. And so, as the years kind of drug on, I know that was really, really hard for, this is not a good sign. I know that was really hard for them. And so eventually they decided to give adoption a shot. And also, doctors, they couldn't give them any reason as to why they weren't able to have kids. It was just kind of a mystery. And so, so they decided to adopt through LDS Social Services. And, I guess it was typically about a 2 to 3 year process to do that. And at some point in the process, my mother's sister-in-law, they also lived in Orem, I think, at the time, and I'm not sure how they knew these people, but they introduced them to a couple of men who, I guess, from their understanding, had served missions in Chile, and so they were trying to set, Mormon families in the United States up with Chilean adoptions. And what stood out to them about that was that it was about a 9-month process, and so that was kind of like too good to pass up.
It was faster, right?
Oh yeah, infinitely faster. I mean, LDS Social Services was at least 2 to 3 years, and this was 9 months. And so I think by this point, they would have been married about 5 years. And so,
Yeah.
when being a mom is like the thing that you want, I would imagine 5 years is an excruciatingly long time. So they made a down payment to these guys, and
thousands of dollars, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I would guess probably at least 1,000. And then after that, so my mom, again, she was working for the Provo School District, was making about $500 a week, and for 3 to 4 months, basically just paid them her entire paycheck. And I'm not sure, where things started to feel fishy, but by that point they were kind of getting the sense that they were getting the runaround in some way. And so then one of the men basically absconded with their money and the money of I guess a bunch of other people, and just kind of disappeared. The other person, he kind of tried to make things right, but I mean, there wasn't much he could do because like his partner stole all of the money, and she feels like it was unexpected for him. Like it wasn't, a conspiracy between the two of them to rip off a bunch of people, but that his partner just turned out to be not a good person. So they hired a lawyer, and which she said, was ultimately kind of a waste of time, but I guess after months and months of some pretty diligent hounding on her part, they were able to get about $1,000 back. But, for the most part, likely lost a few $1,000s, that's not a small amount when you're, first married and, trying to just get through college and prepare to start a family. But so they went back to LDS Social Services, got the paperwork started again, and so as they were starting that, they told them there's about a year-long vetting process to, I guess, try to figure out if they're going to be adequate parents, and then was typically after that vetting process a 1 to 2 year wait. And so I remember her telling me that around the end of that vetting process, she couldn't remember if that year of vetting counted towards like the 2 year average, or if it was the year of vetting and then likely 2 years. And so, she'd reached out and they'd told her, that there's the vetting process and then usually about a 2 year wait. And so, she remembers feeling like that was pretty kind of devastating and disappointing. And, but shortly after, I think just a couple of months after that first year of vetting, they got a call, and it was July 19th, 1982, and they basically said, "Hey, we have a baby if you want it. You can come pick it up tomorrow in Cedar City." So, I mean, it was literally like overnight, went from,
It's going to be a long...
Yeah, it's going to be a long haul, and to, hey, we got a child for you to come pick up if you want it. And my dad had also said that, he really felt like it would probably, they probably wouldn't place with him until he was finished with college, just because,
stability.
Yeah, yeah. So that, I guess, that night they called my dad's parents, who I think they were, I don't know if they were living in Utah yet or they were just visiting Utah, but basically his parents, they were from Florida as well. But his parents drove them down to Cedar City to pick me up. And, on the way home, he said that, my mom and he sat in the back seat, and they just had a pillow in between them and just laid me on the pillow and drove me a couple hundred miles, which maybe that's, I don't know, the first miracle that they didn't get any kind of crash and lose me immediately after getting me, because, car seats weren't a thing at that time, I suppose. But yeah, that's basically, I think, in a nutshell, kind of my parents' story. I guess one other interesting thing. So my mom had a really close relationship with her grandmother, and her grandmother had died in February of 1982, and so my parents were, I guess her grandmother would have been living in Florida at the time, but they still communicated frequently, and her grandmother knew just how much she wanted to be a mom and to have children, and how hard that had been for them. And so, it was, I think it was always kind of sad for my mother that, her grandmother wasn't there to, get to see her actually become a mother. But she also believed that, one other thing that my mom had always said is that she felt like, I just think that if like, I'm sure my grandmother has accepted the gospel, in the,
Afterlife?
Yeah, in the afterlife. And, but she felt convinced that, it wasn't coincidence that my grandmother passed, and then 5 months later they, got a baby that was supposed to take at least another 2 years. That she just
connecting them a little bit.
Yeah, she just felt like maybe her grandmother had, pulled some strings with Heavenly Father and got me sent to them.
Worked some magic up there.
Yeah. So I think that's my parents in a nutshell.
Okay.
So now I want to shift to my bio mom's story. So she was always just loved education. Like she said, if she could be a professional student and not do anything else, then that would kind of be her dream. Mm-hmm. She has 4 degrees, which is
wow,
one more than I have.
Stunning. And what are her degrees in?
3 more than I think anybody should ever have. Man,
do you know?
So one is English literature, and then there's another couple in there, and then just got a PhD in child psychology. I think it is. I think that's the last one.
Yeah.
But so she first school she went to was BYU, and while she was at BYU, she saw an ad for to be a volunteer at a crisis line, which interestingly, is the first. It was the first crisis line in Utah, and like one of the first in the nation. So this was in the 70s, and so one of the things. So maybe I'll preface a little bit. I'm from time to time, I'm going to share some things from her own words. I had really hoped that she could be a part of this, but just
this interview,
but just due to some, life logistics, she wasn't able to do that. So I'm going to try to share some things in her own words. But one thing that she'd said was, it turns out that the moment that I saw the ad in the Daily Universe and felt my soul's inescapable draw to respond, that was when my life pivoted in a direction and with an unstoppable momentum that it might have been seen from space. So this really kind of set her on a path to, it feels silly to say like what the rest of her life was ultimately going to look like, but I think this was a very formative moment for her, and she discovered some, I think, important passions that maybe she, had just kind of been in development before then. But so while she's working at this crisis line, she met another woman who worked there, who was a paraprofessional drug counselor at the Gathering Place in Provo, and so she started volunteering there, and then within about a year they ended up hiring her as a counselor. So she described herself as a 23-year-old who just had developed this passion for saving everyone and everything. And kind of described herself as, becoming like a mother to anyone who just needed to have their buckets filled. One of the things that has stood out to me in every interaction that I've had with her and everything that I've, learned about her life is that she's just such a compassionate and caring and loving person. But so, she also described herself as naive and foolish with no boundaries, but that, she found the work to be really fulfilling. So in the early 70s, she was kind of the lone liberal in a huge conservative Mormon family. So she has, there are 11 children in her family. She's the oldest of them. To give a sense of the spread, her youngest sibling was born when she was 23 years old. So
started as Warrior vibes.
Yeah, very, very, very Saturday's Warrior vibes. But one of the things that she mentioned was that, she tried very hard to kind of have the faith that she saw her siblings have, and it just never came as easily to her, as naturally to her, which is something that I've very much can relate to. So eventually she goes on this 10-day survival excursion in the desert and mountains, which involved, her as a counselor and then another counselor, and then some people who were, as far as I understand, were struggling with substance use and substance addiction. And one of the participants on this outing was a guy from Portland who was friends with the other counselor who was an ex-user. And this guy was 28. My mother was 24, and he was, trying to turn his life around. And so, she was just kind of naturally drawn to kind of that savior role. And so, after about 2 months, they became really close and then ended up eloping, and which, I think she probably sees as one of the first big kind of mistakes in her life. But they were married for about 2 years and ended up having two sons together. And, I don't know a whole lot of details about what she experienced in that, but I get the sense that it was a pretty awful time period. And, she said, so she was 5 months pregnant with her second son when she finally left, and said, I was severely damaged, but miraculously able to escape when I was 5 months pregnant, feeling broken and lost. So I know for a time she moved back in with her parents, who I believe were living in Arizona at the time, but then eventually found herself in Cedar City going to college. So she was 28 and, had decided she wanted to be a CPA, and so was going to school for that. But over time kind of realized that like she was probably more of a people person than a numbers person. And so she switched her major to English Lit with a secondary ed focus, and decided to be a teacher. But it was incredibly difficult being a single mom. And if it's okay, I'll kind of share something that she wrote about that time. She said, sadly, the stress and time demands took a toll on the boys, but they were still young enough to be happy finding frogs with their friends around the subsidized apartment building on a hill in Cedar City. I was getting no child support, although I was receiving food stamps, a very small welfare check, and support in my schooling. We were still extremely poor, and an occasional $25 check from my sweet grandmother allowed for cheap sneakers for them and a precious and indulgent outing for burgers and fries at Arctic Circle. Sometimes I find myself overcome with sorrow at all that my boys were missing by not having a father in their lives. Their father tried to convince me for many months to give him the oldest, and you can have the other one, that he didn't know yet and had no connection to, when he could not plead or threaten or guilt me into returning to him. But distance really helped prevent him from fulfilling his threats. I would not sacrifice them to his toxicity and his addictions. He was back to shooting up and would deny it and tell me I was crazy, even when I found his paraphernalia under the sink, or the ongoing consequences of his severe mood disorders that darkened every sky we'd lived under, nor allow them to be vulnerable to his sociopathology and self-loathing example. They are grateful for that protection and that they were raised by a mother so they could better understand, communicate with, and cherish women. But their forgiveness and perpetual love toward me has never completely freed me from the monumental regret that they did not grow up with a pair of mentally healthy parents, a father free of addictions, and the honest ability to love from having been clearly loved by happy parents.
Wow.
Yeah. And I share that in part to give a sense of kind of where she was coming from and I think what she'd endured up into that time, but it also very much informs, her decision eventually related to me.
Right.
So while she's working towards her degree, she ends up taking a choir class, just, kind of for fun. And just found herself really drawn to this, kind of charismatic and charming professor, with, whom she shared a lot of things in common. And so they start kind of seeing each other, and pretty quickly he starts also pushing for more intimacy than she was comfortable with.
Do you know if he was married?
He was not married.
Okay.
Yeah, he was single. I'm not sure what their age gap was. I know he was older, but it also,
Power.
Yeah, there were definitely would have been power dynamics. But also, she wasn't like a 20-year-old freshman and he was like a 40-year-old professor. Like, she'd had some experience in the world.
She was older, he was younger.
Yeah, she was 28, 29, somewhere in there. But yeah, I'm not sure how much older he was, but but he also hated the church, and she hadn't been been terribly active. She'd been kind of distanced from the church for a time, but had also been feeling like she needed to kind of get back into the church, in particular for her boys. Like she thought it would be good for them and kind of give them a solid foundation. So in her mind, she just knew it wasn't ultimately going to go anywhere. And so I guess they hadn't seen each other for a few weeks, and one night he came over, and so they spent a lot of time talking, and then it got late, and he decided or we asked her if he could just I'll just sleep on the couch, like I promise I'll honor your boundaries. And so in her words, she just kind of naively was like, okay, that's fine. And so at some point in the middle of the night, he went into a room, and here I am. And to be clear, according to her, she didn't describe it as
assault. Yeah,
as an assault or as unwanted. Just more, she just described herself as just kind of feeling weak and giving in to something that, on some level she wanted to do, but at the same time,
weak or human.
Yeah. I mean, that's how I would describe it. Certainly not weak, because, we've all been there. Mm-hmm. But the next morning, she said that, she just had the disturbing sense that she'd conceived. And then, sure enough, she had. So eventually after she confirmed it, she invites him over to break the news, and he responded, pretty terribly. Like he was really angry, and, ended up storming out, claiming, like she'd ruined his life, and then he demanded that she get an abortion. And she did not intend to get an abortion. And I guess there was a handful of people in different parts of her life who also ultimately kind of counseled the same thing. But, after several days, he came back and was like, all right, well, if you're not going to get an abortion, then we have to get married.
Wow. This guy's was a piece of work.
Yeah. Cause that's always a really good idea, is to, if you are deeply incompatible in a lot of ways,
and get an abortion, or let's get married.
Yeah. Sort of mixed signals, but whatever. So, obviously she was like, no, I don't.
I'm thinking not.
Yeah. That doesn't seem like good for anyone
Not
involved.
a great start.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, we're laughing.
So
No,
hard.
it is fine to laugh because it's ridiculous. But, so obviously she said no, and he stayed enraged with her throughout the pregnancy. Refused to sign for the adoption until just a few days before I was born. When I was with my birth, I got a letter from her, and I got a letter from him, and his. I tried really hard to find it, because his is pretty amusing, but it's like maybe 3/4 of a page, and starts out, "Hello, I am your birth father, 6'2", blonde hair, blue-eyed,
Oh, wow.
fairly with a fairly athletic and muscular build, and relatively intelligent and good looking," literally says this. And then he tells me a little bit about his, my father was English and Swiss. My mother was Polish. I enjoy sailing and some other things. And he's like, your mother, she was a beautiful woman. Says a few things, and he's like, you were conceived out of love, which was a line I've always loved. Which, the way that she describes it, I don't feel like I was conceived out of love, but doesn't matter. But he, at some point in it, he says, at first I intended to adopt you myself, but there was resistance, which that's all he says about that. And then he says, and having lost my job from like this situation, I didn't have a means to support you. And so
he was fired for sleeping with a student.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I guess that's what ultimately happened with him. He got fired. I guess he ended up getting some kind of a faculty position at, I think, a university in Washington that came with some kind of a small stipend, but wouldn't be enough to support me. So I think it was kind of at that point that he, seemed to kind of relent, and I think that's at the point that he signed the adoption papers. So that to my bio mom, I think felt like a little bit of, the hand of Providence, moving this situation in the direction that she felt like it needed to go. But, so during her pregnancy, she described it as a pretty agonizing time, so she's really wrestling with, this kind of conundrum about what to do. She's taking classes, she's writing papers, she's doing exams, and she's, experiencing really terrible morning sickness. And
she has 2 kids, right?
And 2 little boys.
It's like she had a very full plate.
Single mom.
Before.
Yeah.
And now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think my half brothers would have been like 5 and 2 or 6 and 3. So, just little.
Yeah.
But, in addition to all these different challenges, she's also just experiencing all kinds of shame and embarrassment for, being not only already a single mom, but then like a pregnant single mom, which, in the 80s, like
in Utah.
Yeah. I mean, 80s in Utah in particular, probably not a whole lot of compassion for
after already being divorced.
Right. So just all kinds of stigmas that, that she's already experiencing. And so, but she, described experiencing, a lot of judgment from people that had been her closest friends, and especially as she'd, kind of settled on the idea of placing me for adoption, having these women who were mothers being like, how could you give, how are you going to do that? Like, how can you possibly give up a child, almost like shaming her for considering that option. Bio dad finally calls, a few days before I'm born, just says, you win, and sign the papers. And so that was that. But she talked about once she'd kind of finally come to the decision to place me for adoption, that she started to, or she basically stopped thinking of me as her baby and started kind of thinking of me and referring to me as their baby, and not knowing who they were, but she felt like that that had kind of helped her start to
psychological, maybe some distancing.
Yeah, work on that process of letting go. Yeah. So I guess the night before I was born, she had a friend help her make a quilt for me, which so I got two things from her. one being a letter, and then the other one, excuse me. The other one being this quilt. So this is something that she'd said about making that quilt. She said, "It was made with a calming and sweet thought of how happy your parents were going to be. But I will never forget the pain I felt when my dear, well-meaning friend bunched the finished quilt in her arms. Sorry. When my dear, well-meaning friend bunched the quilt in her arms as though she were cradling a baby and said to me, 'Are you sure you want to give it up?' And I knew that she could not understand. None of the mothers who said, 'I could never do that,' could also understand. And I could still forgive them because of that lack of understanding. I wouldn't have wished upon any of them. I'm sorry to confess that the moment you came into the world was truly horrible for me. The cry I heard was going to be the first and the last I would hear. From that new little voice. Sorry. The cry I heard was going to be the first and the last I would hear from that new little voice, so familiar. And the loss was something I could never describe to anyone who has not experienced it. I've worried that you bore the mark on your heart of that dark hole in my own heart. I've learned since about implicit memories and the impact of them on a life. But I've hoped that the likely good of your life would have burned any residue that might have existed, or that might have existed. She goes on to say that postpartum depression and the reality of that day was so heavy that I was unable to do anything other than cry. I can't remember if I had yet written the letter to your parents, but I know that I had not yet written the one to you because I wanted to know your gender so I could address you properly. But I was horrified to be so crippled and unable to begin the letter that must be written. After signing the papers, and now that there was no chance supposedly to change my mind, I was reminded that seeing you would be a huge mistake, but they would not stop me from seeing you even though I was not allowed to touch you. Why do that to myself? But something inside me propelled me to the room they had you in by yourself, and I looked upon your face. You were so beautiful. And I was told you couldn't be more healthy and strong. I was relieved by that information, but also by the fact that at least in the image my mind provided at the time, you did not look much like my boys, which I don't, having seen them. That allowed me the final letting go and the ability, at least, to write to you. That was the only time I believed I would ever see your face, and the only words I believed I would ever speak to you. But I knew you'd hear them and would know the why that I could not allow you to live without. So,
hey, can you put words to what you're feeling, if you want to?
Yeah. I think it's just maybe it's a recognition or just some kind of a feeling of not being able to fathom how a person makes that decision. I'm never going to grow a human inside of my body. But I would imagine that probably, instills upon one just some kind of indescribable ownership and connection. And ownership feels like a gross word, but I don't mean it in the sense that anybody owns anybody, but
stewardship.
Just a responsibility, like just a connection that I think, any non-uterus bearing human will ever understand. But just the kind of strength that it must have taken for her to make that choice is, it's just overwhelming to me. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe the other piece of it is just the gratitude. Yeah, it's the gratitude that I feel towards her.
Now, why, this may sound like a rough question, but why gratitude and not like resentment or abandonment? Why gratitude? I guess you may talk about that later, but.
Yeah, I guess just in a nutshell, and I think I will be able to clarify this later, but just the life that I've had and have gotten to live is all a result of that sacrifice that she made. And part of, I think one of the key reasons why I'm able to feel the way that I do, is because of what it's two reasons. One, because of what she conveyed to me, in the letter that I'll share in a moment, and also just the way that my own parents handled my adoption and approached my adoption. I feel like if I don't know, they nailed it. Like they just did it right. Mm-hmm. And I'll go into that more a little bit later, but.
Can I ask you a question
Please.
about what you just read, just to clarify? So was that from the letter you received from her? Is that an excerpt from the letter that you received when or did this come later?
This came later. So this was.
Just wanted to know
So this came from some of our initial, once we found each other, some initial correspondence.
Got it.
Which I feel really blessed to have. Just because, it allows me to tell some of her story in her words.
That's right. Yes.
So as I'd mentioned, all that I had from her was a letter and a blanket, and she also wrote she also wrote a letter to my parents, as she'd mentioned. But well, yeah, if it's okay, I'd like to share some portions of what she wrote to me, and I'm going to try to steel myself and power through this a little bit better than the last one.
Oh, I wouldn't say better. Yeah.
I guess one of my problems is that when I get emotional, I feel like my voice is just real ugly and hideous. And so I have a hard time just speaking through the emotion. So I'm going to try to let go of that and just read, even if I'm.
Can I just say, to be clear, it was beautiful.
Thank you.
Hearing you read that and feel it, and your emotions seemed absolutely in line with what you were reading. Really makes sense.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I also realize we're on a podcast and it's important for me to keep going. So, but okay. So, she starts the letter, "Dear friend," which I guess I don't know what to. I think that's an interesting way to start it. I don't know. Dear friend, I must have written this letter 100 times in my mind during the last 9 months. I was afraid to put it down on paper until now, because I wanted it to be right and to say just how I felt, or to say how I felt in just the words that were closest to my feelings. Now that you were born and I've seen you, somehow it's a little easier to speak to you. There are a few very important things that you must believe and try to understand. First, the woman you call mom and the man you call father are your real, true, forever parents, and the ones that Heavenly Father wanted you to have, and that possibly you chose yourself before you were born. Only in their family could you have be having, and yet will have the special challenges and opportunities that will help your patriarchal blessing and become the man you were born to be. I know your parents are not perfect and maybe even frustrate and anger you at times, and my own parents have made mistakes. I was the oldest child just like you, and didn't always do what I wanted or gave me what I wanted, but I wouldn't trade them for anyone else in the whole world, because they're mine and I'm theirs, and we love each other no matter what. The second thing I want you to know is that I did not ever at one moment resent you or not want you. In fact, if I hadn't loved you so much, I could never have let your parents have you. I'll explain that because I know it seems confusing. When I knew you were going to be born, I was afraid, embarrassed because of not being married, and worried about how my family would feel, but also very anxious to have you. I'd wanted a baby for a long time, but then I got a strong feeling that because I'd been raised in the church and taught to pray, I knew I must ask my Heavenly Father what was the right thing to do and what was best for you. The answer was very, very painful to me, but for the first real time in my life, I knew without a doubt that I received an unmistakable answer to my prayer, even though it wasn't the one I wanted or expected. Since then, I've tried to make the answer different, but never could deny what Heavenly Father had told me to do. It wasn't because he was trying to punish me or because he was using you to make me feel sorry or ashamed. Heavenly Father isn't that way. He loves you, and he loves me, and he loves your mother and father more than any of us can possibly imagine. And because he loves us so much, he let me be the friend and sister who brought your spirit to earth and to the right family, and allowed you and your dear parents to know and love each other all these years. I have been promised and comforted that they and you are a forever family. Otherwise, I could never have let you go. Finally, I want you to realize and believe, if you don't already, that you were and are cherished by the Lord so much that he literally performed miracles in order to assure that you would be just where you are today. I was a part of those miracles, and the warmth and comfort I am being blessed with, especially during these last few days, when it has been hardest for me, come from a loving Father who has been and still is there for you too, whenever you choose to let it warm you like a blanket. Know beyond a doubt that you've been loved and wanted from the time before your existence was realized. Please believe and know who you are, and know how very much you're worth to all those who've ever loved you, and especially to your heavenly parents. We are all one family. Love through eternity, your loving friend and sister.
It's clear at the time she was kind of an Orthodox Mormon believer, because she's referencing your patriarchal blessing. She's talking about miracles, so you can tell her mindset is wrapped in Mormon Orthodox theology and doctrine.
Yeah, I think she was. I guess I get more of a sense that that's what she wanted to be, like that's where she was hoping to be, and and that, throughout this experience, she kind of started to maybe arrive at that place. 'Cause I genuinely believe that she felt inspired somehow, some way to make the decision that she did. And so, I think that served to maybe awaken some of a testimony in her that she'd struggled to really find before that, or solidify before that. But the letter that she wrote to my parents kind of said a lot of similar things. A few of the differences were, she was, I think, very gracious in how she approached the idea of a blanket. She said, I would hope that you'd be open to letting him have this, but I also understand if it makes you uncomfortable, and if it does, then, please don't do it. But just please know that this isn't a gesture on my part where I'm in some way trying to create some kind of a wedge or a barrier, a blanket, in between you. If it feels right, let him have it. And where I think my parents really did everything right, or maybe did the most right, was they've never acted with any sort of jealousy or
competitiveness.
Yeah, there's never been any kind of insecurity around her and learning anything about her.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. I can I just say
Please.
too that the amount of care that she intentionally, it's going to make me sorry, gave you, as she basically, handed you over. And at the same time, really having the insight as to what you might struggle with, or what story you might create about who you are. It's really something to witness. And I haven't heard a lot of stories quite like this either. So the fact that she was able to be have this presence of mind amid so much turmoil, and clearly a lot of pain and loss, as she's, really clearly doing something very difficult. Yeah, it's really moving.
No, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
I owe so much of, I think, how I ultimately felt about it to her ability to craft, I think, the exact words that I would need to hear growing up. And I think the letter that she wrote to my parents also had a similar impact on them and their approach to it as well. So, I guess maybe kind of all of these things together can probably give you a sense of why my parents very much viewed this all as kind of a miracle story. And, this was further bolstered by, after 10 years of infertility, my mom bore my baby sister, and then two more children after that. And so, it's always kind of been this just belief in our family that, they couldn't have kids because for whatever reason, I had to come a different way. And that was something that, I guess part of what, I always wondered just all throughout my life growing up was like what happened to this woman in the aftermath of this? Like, was this the thing that, really did reignite her testimony? And because I guess one of the things that she mentioned in the letter to my parents that isn't in mine is, she talked about how she'd kind of been, distanced from the church for a number of years, and that so she gave like a little bit of that background of how, she hadn't always been, incredibly faithful, and that like this, my conception wasn't just like, kind of a one-off mistake that, any, good, faithful Mormon person can make, but that, she'd been just distanced from the church, and that this had almost kind of been like a wake-up call. So I'd always just wondered, like, maybe that's why I had to come the way that I did, was that in order for, Heavenly Father to bring her back to the church, like my mother's womb had to not work for a while. and so I had to come through her so that then, she could have this experience that would then like bring her back to the fold.
How old are you when I think stories are important, the stories that we create to understand ourselves and our origins. Yeah. So when you're saying that, how old are you when you're kind of thinking that way of, maybe?
Yeah. I would imagine probably in my teenage years that idea kind of started to form. And, I'm not going to go a lot into mission stuff, but I know that, that was definitely something I thought a lot about on my mission. And, I often shared my adoption story as kind of just a faith promoting story as a missionary. But yeah, I think definitely during my teenage years and into early adulthood, that was something that I thought about a lot.
Mm-hmm. If I can just add one piece of context for the Never Mormons out there, or for the young Mormons, I mentioned jokingly Saturday's Warrior just to kind of explain what that's about.
Right.
Saturday's Warrior is a musical that came out in the 70s, Mormon musical, that's built on this Mormon theological teaching that we were all created as spirit children of Heavenly Father and mothers, and that we all existed as spirit children in what's called the preexistence before the earth was created. So we're all up in this heaven-like thing before the earth is created with Heavenly Father and mothers and all the spirit children. And what has been taught and what was passed on to the Saturday's Warrior musical was this idea that in the preexistence, we met our parents or our children and our siblings, and we all agreed in the preexistence to become family. But also built into that is, and this is in the drama of the Saturday's Warrior musical, that if you don't live righteously, you might forfeit the chance for one of your pre-agreed upon children or siblings or parents to, have you in this life. The example of the Saturday's Warrior is the parents are trying to decide whether or not to have their final kid. And one of the oldest sons is like mad about overpopulation of the earth, and he's pressuring the parents not to have that baby. And so the baby, Emily is up in heaven going, you promised, basically begging the family to have the baby, the parents to have the baby, the brother to not pressure the parents to not have the baby so that she can come down and be with her predestined family versus some horrible family of color in a different country that isn't Mormon, which would be a disaster. You know what I mean? And so your parents would have, your birth mom, but also your adoptive parents would have very much probably been influenced by Saturday's Warrior and those teachings, thinking also that you were a spirit up in heaven that they had met before, and that you were meant to come down to them and that they were meant to raise you. That's a long explanation, but I think it provides probably some important context.
Oh, for sure. I feel like I need to watch Saturday's Warrior again. Yeah, that definitely rings very true to just how, my adoption was spoken about and thought of in our family. I all growing up, I don't know how many times like I heard some version of my story from, the pulpit and I mean, I know my mom probably shared the story with every Relief Society that she was ever in. But yeah, there was always just this sense that, for whatever reason, that was the way that I had to come. And so, I think it was really natural for me to try to ascribe some kind of meaning to that, Right. And so for me, it was like, well, why would I have to, like, it might've been different if all my siblings were adopted. 'Cause then, I don't know, that sends me down a different logical path. But the fact that, they had 3 natural children after that, it's like, well, why, what other reason could there be than that, something about that experience was what would like set my bio mom, back on the right path.
It is interesting to reflect that being you, I would imagine, but like that part of your identity is this, that your origin story is a Mormon faith promoting story. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, my, well, as I grew up, this ended up kind of being like the main pillar of my testimony.
Right.
So as I don't ever remember any particular moment when my parents told me I was adopted. It's just something that I always knew. Mm-hmm. And again, they always treated it like something special. It was never, it probably helped that I kind of had the privilege of at least kind of looking like my mother. So like we both have blonde hair and blue eyes. And so, nobody ever believed me that I was adopted. Like if I would tell friends that I was, they'd basically have to like go to my house and my mom would have to confirm it because they just generally didn't believe me. So, I think that there's definitely some like luck and privilege in that mm-hmm. I didn't have everybody constantly questioning like, are you adopted? Or like what, right. wondering like, why don't I look anything like my family? Even though like when I objectively look at like, I don't think I look anything like my father, but we're both, about the same height. And so it's plausible, especially when you like see my mom next to her. My siblings, they definitely look different than like they all have darker hair than I do, but sometimes like
that happens in
so just
biological families too.
So I never like had a feeling of not belonging.
Can I ask you just a quick question? Growing up, did you ever have moments growing up where you did feel different, or that within your family system, or that within yourself, you felt othered in some way? Or would you say that the origin story and your experience of your family kind of covered for a lot of that?
Yes.
That?
Yeah, no, I really don't ever remember feeling like out of place or different or like I didn't belong. Like I know that, even when I was pissed at my parents or, upset as a kid, like I never threw like, you're not my real parents at them. It just, Yeah, I always felt as much a part of the family, as much their child as any of my siblings, if not maybe more, because like I was the first one. And so,
Yeah.
and I mean, like have kind of a running joke in my family. Like I just refer to myself as being purchased. And and so I would sometimes like tease my siblings, be like, oh, like they had to pay a lot of money for me. Like, you just, not obviously understanding that, it costs money to also birth a child, but yeah, I mean, it almost like, I don't know, if anything, it almost felt like, even though maybe my sister is the actual miracle, I always felt like, my provenance was
Golden boy.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Instead of being broken, you were chosen or something.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, I had to arrive through a very specific and special track.
Nice. That's good framing.
Yeah, it's very helpful. But also, all of my grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins, they all approached it the same way. Like it was,
You're the miracle baby, the miracle child.
Yeah, it was rather than ever being weird, it was special.
Don't we like the framing for like every baby?
Yeah, but
Every baby, in truth, is a miracle.
Oh
baby.
yeah,
But yes.
no, but there's also the reverse. There's probably a very common framing. My mom didn't want me, or my parents didn't want me, and it doesn't sound like you were plagued with that either.
No, never that. And I think that, again, going back to the way that my bio mom was able to just frame her letter to me and to them, she made it painstakingly clear that this had nothing to do with not being wanted and everything to do with being loved.
Yep.
That's right.
So I guess as a child and teenager, grew up in a pretty quintessential Mormon family.
What city?
So I grew. So from like 7 to almost 14, I lived in Orem. And then my dad, I'd mentioned previously that he'd.
That's in Utah near Provo for those who don't know.
Yeah, so he'd gone into the foundry business. He had opened his own foundry, and then when I was almost 14, he moved that foundry. It was in Salt Lake, and he'd been commuting for years and hating it. And this was like right during all of that like nightmare I-15 construction preceding the Olympics.
Wait, has that ever ended? I was going to say, but yeah, it was particularly bad during the Olympics.
Yeah, but so he was commuting during a lot of just that revamp of I-15, and so it would take him like sometimes an hour and a half or more just to So ends up moving his business to Nephi, and so then that's where I spent my high school years, was in Nephi.
Nephi's near Lehi. No, wait. Nephi's where?
South. It's 40 minutes south of Provo.
Oh, that's right. Near the lavender fields.
Yeah, a little bit south of. So Mona is.
That's right.
Mona is where they presently live, and then, but yeah, Nephi is another 6 miles.
Is that where you
south
meet
of Mona.
Kyle?
Yeah, in Nephi. That's
This
where
is Kyle Ashworth of Latter Gay Stories. He referred Andrew to us. Hey, Kyle.
Hello, Kyle. But yeah, so it feels like for most of my like childhood and teen years, my dad was always in a bishopric or in young men's or scouts. Just church was very central to our lives. I think I probably experienced most of the kind of similar teen boy experiences growing up as a Mormon. I recently dug out an old For Strength of Youth pamphlet and just was a little bit astounded by how much that just set up like my entire teenage years to be just full of shame.
Explain that to the Never Mormons.
Yeah.
Oh man. I mean,
just briefly.
Well, so it's for Strength of Youth pamphlet. It was this kind of like, it's like little 24 page booklet of guidelines for how to be a righteous and good youth of the church. And so it had all kinds of standards related to like dress, which, I mean, that set up a lot of conflict, like between me and my dad in particular, because there's some line in there about, how you present yourself or the way you dress sends a message to the people around you and influences the way that other people act. So, for me, like I was into, like I wanted to be and I was like into punk rock in high school. And so, wanted to wear baggy jeans and color my hair and studded belts. And my dad, wasn't a fan of any of that. And, just felt like, just the messages you're sending, like people are going to think things about you. And I mean, I remember just hearing like my parents like arguing through the air ducts about me. And my mom was generally like, he's a good kid. It's fine. Like if he wants to color his hair, it doesn't mean he's like doing drugs. And cause like I genuinely was like, I was a super straight laced teenager. And, but so that's, set up some conflicts between me and my father. Just the fact that, in the pamphlet, like in the section around, like sexual purity and all of that, like it literally had, like when it's talking about like the law of chastity and what's forbidden, it has sexual relations, petting, sex perversions, and then in parentheses, homosexuality, rape, incest, followed immediately by masturbation, which like
rape, incest, same-sex love, and masturbation, they're all kind of indistinguishable.
Yeah. And I mean, I know that
all sins next to murder, basically.
Right. Yeah. I know grammatically, like the parentheses is important. But like, my 13, 14, 15-year-old brain just saw that order: homosexuality, rape, incest, masturbation. And so, I spent a lot of my teenage years full of a lot of self-loathing, thinking I was, addicted to very natural human functions. And, part of, that in addition to just in every single priesthood session, just harping on like the evils and the dangers of pornography. Like I thought during, again, most of my teenage years and even early 20s that, because I looked at porn, I don't know, every couple of months, that I was an addict. And, and underlying, like, there was always kind of underlying any of that shame. And why I bring it up is because I always felt like not only was I was letting down not just like my parents, but Heavenly Father, who had also like done so much to like orchestrate my life and like guide me into this family. And I'm like destroying my forever family with like these horrible, evil things that I was doing, like these sins next to murder,
and tarnishing the miracle of your adoption and your family story.
Yeah, almost being ungrateful for it. And like I remember this really poignant moment. We'd gone to, I think it was maybe the opening of maybe it was the Linden Temple. Is there one in Pleasant Grove? I don't remember, but
yes,
it's somewhere in that region, I think.
There's a Pleasant Grove Temple.
And I must have been 15, 16. And we'd just gone to the open house. And, I remember on the drive home, I guess that this must have been a time where, I don't know, logged maybe 4 or 5, 6 months without one of the sins next to murder. And I remember just thinking like, almost praying that like our van would just like flip over and we would all die, because I was like, I feel like we're all safe. Like
you die worthy versus relapse and then die unworthy.
That's so heavy.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, what a wildly horrible thing for like a teenage to literally wish that his whole family could die in that moment, because it felt like a rare moment of worthiness, like where we would, all be able to be together forever. But yeah, so one thing that, that's always kind of nagged at me, or I think maybe like the first thing that ever nagged at me about related to my faith in the church, was when I got my patriarchal blessing. So I hadn't read it in probably 15 years. And I got it out, for the first time, maybe 6 months ago. But even having not read it, there was always one line that I just vividly and distinctly remembered, which was, it was kind of in the, I think maybe the, kind of in the middle of of the blessing. It said, like Nephi of old, you too were born of goodly parents. And I remember sitting there in that, I don't know, do Never Mormons need to know what a patriarchal blessing is?
Yeah, I mean, you can give a brief.
So it's just this, every LDS person is entitled to one. And, usually you get it when you're a teenager, and it's kind of like it's like a little miniature prophecy. So every stake, from my understanding, has a stake patriarch, and they give you this blessing that kind of like lays out the direction of your life. And in addition to that, it gives you, gives you your lineage, in terms of like what house or like what tribe in the house of Israel you're from. And then it, makes a lot of different, now I recognize as very vague promises about, where like the direction that your life might go. And so
it's kind of like Mormon fortune telling.
Yeah. It feels very much like that.
But sort of approved, sanctioned from God. It's like God telling you, giving you a roadmap for your life.
Right. And, from my understanding, they're generally just kind of vague and basic, like you someday will take a sweet daughter of God to the temple and, have a family and
serve a mission for the church.
Right. You'll serve in many like important callings. And so it's all things that like,
and rise in the morning of the first resurrection to be exalted and become like God.
Unless you got one of the blessings over the years that said you'd be alive when Christ would come.
That's right.
Or you'll be an apostle.
Apostle someday. Right.
Yeah. Mine, it was disappointing to me that I didn't get the apostleship nod, but I guess it turned out okay. But yeah, that like, I remember that moment. He's like, you were born of goodly parents. And I was like,
wait a minute. It's like that.
No, I wasn't. Like,
it's like that album Scratch. It's like,
yeah. I was like, no, I know very distinctly that I was born of at least one badly parent. And I was like, I was a product of fornication. Like, how is he going to say that, like, again, just bear in mind, this is like teenage Mormon mind thinking. I wouldn't speak of my birth and conception and that. Yeah. But that's how I felt at the time. And so I was like, how does this guy, he can literally like tell me like what blood of Israel is flowing through my veins, but he doesn't know that I'm adopted. And I remember bringing that up to my mom at some point. I was like, how come, like, why do you think this says that I was born of goodly parents? 'Cause like I'm adopted. She's like, well, I mean,
it's all metaphor.
Yeah. It's like it can still be like, it's like referring to us, it's born is just it's just, it's just a word. I don't know. So
what does born really mean?
What is born really? Like, we're all born. It doesn't matter. But it was something that like was always just kind of like hanging out in the back of my mind. And I was like, no, I was raised of goodly parents. I wasn't born of goodly parents. So I guess the other piece is that as I was growing up, I never really felt strongly that I felt the Spirit. So, I would sit in, these testimony meetings or conference, general conference or, whatever. And, people around me would just be like crying or, talking about like, oh, I could just feel like this burning in my bosom. And I just never got the burning in the bosom. And, I remember even like the first time I finished the Book of Mormon as a kid, like, trying to take this like special, thoughtful moment and praying, like, doing Moroni's promise. Moroni's promise, and just kind of sitting there in silence with like nothing and feeling very baffled by that. And I kind of always just assumed that there was something wrong with me, that like maybe I wasn't being righteous enough, or, I wasn't like keeping my covenants well enough. And, I had a handful of experiences, like I went to EFY a couple of times. And so, like there would be moments where which is like basically like church youth camp, at BYU, or that I don't know if they still do it, but I, like the only moments where I guess how I kind of started to identify or try to define feeling the Spirit was just like when I like feel kind of like excited. And usually that would be if I was, like testifying about, I don't know, like bearing my testimony, probably about my adoption. But just like feeling like a little bit excited, I was like, oh, I guess that's probably the Spirit. Or if I just felt sort of calm, I was like, I guess that's probably the Spirit. And, but I just never had any like really strong moments or strong impressions. And so I very much just leaned on my adoption story as kind of like, well, it's like too crazy for it not to be true, or for there not to like, for God not to have had some kind of a hand in it. And so yeah, that's really where I, kind of, like that was my foundation. And so that like, even that little moment in the patriarchal blessing where like they kind of got that wrong, like that put some cracks in my shelf. And I guess so during my teenage years, one of the things that I think my parents always did right was, as I'd mentioned previously, like they never came off as defensive or insecure about my adoption. And in fact, my mom was always really, really encouraging about, me, if I ever wanted to, trying to find my birth parents. Adoption now is so wildly different than it was at that time. Yeah. So, now here's so often like, I think most of the people that I've like youth that I've worked with as a therapist, who are adopted, like they know their bio parents, or they've met them, or they have some kind of contact. And so at this time, with at least with LDS Social Services, like all adoptions were sealed. And so the only way that you could ever make any kind of contact or find out, who the only way I could have ever found out who my bio mother was if there was some kind of like a medical emergency and I needed like a kidney or a blood transfusion or something that was like a last, resort. Then they might, unseal them and go that way. So, barring a catastrophic health failure, there was kind of no way I was ever going to get to know who she was. And so I'd pretty much assumed that, was probably my reality. However, I was also fairly certain that because I was born in Cedar City and knowing that, my bio dad had been a professor, she a student, I deduced that, it's probably SUU. There's a pretty good chance of it. And so it's like, well, maybe one way that I can find her is if I find him. And the way maybe I can find him is if I look at, was there a college professor of music there in 1982 and then not there anymore in 1983?
Right.
And so, I kind of always had this idea in the back of my mind. And so at some point I was telling my high school, so I kind of switched or got into a new friend group partway through my senior year of high school, one of which happened to be Kyle. And
Kyle Ashworth of Latter-day Stories. Hey, Kyle.
Yeah. Hello again. And so one day Kyle comes over to my house and he's like, Fish, we found your dad. I was like, what? He's like, no, I found your dad. And he has a yearbook from, it was either 81 or 82 from SUU. And he's like, opens it up. He's like, it's this guy. And
that's pretty proactive of Kyle.
Yeah,
finding your dad for you.
But does it surprise you at all, knowing Kyle? I feel like it's the most Kyle thing that has ever happened. But yeah, so he points out this kind of goofy looking dude, and I was like, that is not my dad. That guy he just looks too goofy. He doesn't look like me. They're like, he looks just like you. I was like, no, that for sure not my dad, whatever. And so there was, nothing I could really do with that. So I just kind of
shelved it
and moved on with life. And, trying to think for continuity's sake, if I should just go to share that, the resolution to that story. Turns out that was my dad. But I'll maybe come back to that later. But so let's see. So yeah, I guess as a missionary, I used my adoption story as kind of this faith promoting story. And mission was kind of similar to the rest of my life. I still struggled to feel like I strongly felt the Spirit, but really kind of just identified that, that feeling of when you're sharing something that you very much believe in and feel passionate about with someone who doesn't know about that thing, you feel like there's that kind of excitement, that kind of animated feeling. And so I was like, I guess that's that must be the Spirit, which, eventually that becomes problematic for me because I also eventually realized well, there's lots of times where I feel that feeling. For example, if one of my favorite things to do is to share either film or music or television or something that I think is moving or beautiful, with someone who hasn't experienced that yet. And oftentimes I, would find myself feeling the Spirit when sharing a very something where the Spirit's not allowed to be, so music that has the F-bomb or rated R films or, something in that effect. And so, identifying the Spirit as that becomes problematic for me at some point, but still, I ultimately kind of leaned on that adoption story as, that has to be the church has to be true because it's too improbable. And I think like I don't know, the mission was hard for me. I think it was an area where I feel genuinely shocked that I didn't leave the mission with like diagnosable scrupulosity. Cause I was just a very like, just by the books, by the rules missionary. Like I was one of those psychopaths who like, the rules said we had to be in, in our apartments by 9:30. And if it's like 9:25 and we're, a mile away, like we're booking it in our suits to like, meet that letter of the law and be in the door by 9:30. Mm-hmm. But I also found that, everything you hear before going on a mission it's the best 2 years. Like in any homecoming talk you would hear, like they would just talk about like, I just loved the people so much. Like I loved it. It was the greatest time of my life. And I never felt that way. Like it was, in a lot of ways, it felt like kind of drudgery to me. And, and I think my family would probably have a different perspective on that just because of like how I wrote letters home, cause I wanted it to sound like every other mission what I assumed every other missionary was experiencing was this this like wonderful time where you're just getting lost in the service and just loving what you're doing, loving the people. And I found that I often didn't love the people. Like in a lot of ways, I felt like the message that I had and like the way that I'd kind of grown up with a lot of really sort of conservative, like bootstrap ideals was like, these people this people are in poverty because like they're lazy or because like they're not they haven't accepted the gospel, or if they don't accept the gospel, it's because like, they're just not great people. So I feel like it made me, I felt frequently judgmental towards people. Like I loved people who would hear the message and would accept the gospel. But like looking back, like I honestly feel a great deal of kind of guilt and shame around just like what my mindset was like on the mission, that like I was supposed to be a representative of Christ who, is this person that loves everyone and doesn't judge people. And looking back on that, I feel like I was incredibly judgmental and, came home with again, not to the point of having scrupulosity, but I feel like I carried a lot of that home with me, at least for the first while, which I think kind of set me up to crash and burn a little bit as soon as like I stopped being basically perfect, or what I thought would be perfect. But as I'd mentioned, like if my patriarchal blessing kind of put like the first like little crack on my shelf, it was ultimately Prop 8 that ended up shattering that shelf. So like for the first couple years after I got home from my mission, like I stayed pretty active and did did all the things I was supposed to do, and then just kind of gradually lost the like mission glow and started just being a regular human again and struggling with some of the things that I'd struggled with, and like growing up in high school, and then just kind of started feeling increasingly uncomfortable in the church. So, I was living in Utah County and had like slightly longer hair, would wear, colored shirts to church. And
such a statement.
It
really is.
Yeah, which I mean, and I know at the time I was doing it in part because I was like wanting to prove a point, like
and it's expressive.
Yeah.
And teen years, right? There's a developmental wiring there
totally.
to individualize.
Absolutely. And, like the closer I got to my, mid-20s, the more I started to like panic because I was getting pretty old and was not married. And I would end up in these like,
why didn't you get married right after mission? I know it's a presumptuous question, but it wasn't
for lack of trying.
My effort was very high.
My effort was valiant in that regard. No, I dated, and I guess like what it would boil down to is I just never found anyone that I was interested in for longer than like a couple of months. Mm-hmm. And like the first girl that I dated for, longer than I think a few weeks, I felt like, I was like, I probably need to marry her because like, I think she'd be a great mom. I'm not really super interested in her, but like, I can probably learn to be. And, and so glad I didn't follow that train, but yeah, just for whatever reason, by 24, just an old, unmarried man, a menace to societies, I think Brigham Young would have put it. And, but I'd be in these BYU wards with like these, like 21-year-old, like recently returned missionaries and, girls around the same age, and just feeling so old and weird and out of place. Oh. And so like that kind of started to shift me and, towards a little bit of inactivity. That coupled with, like had some law of chastity issues, like would just go like a little bit too far with girlfriends and then would, start on like the arduous road to repentance with like working with a bishop. And as it would turn out, like not being able to take the sacrament ever and often not being able to have callings and never getting to go to the temple doesn't exactly like nurture your spirit and foster testimony growth.
And make you want to attend.
Yeah. Cause it's, it can be such a shaming process, like if you're sitting there in a college singles ward and someone hands you like the sacrament tray and you pass it along, either, oh, he's addicted to porn, he's addicted to masturbation, or he's like having sex. Like that's at least what you're assuming that everybody else is, everybody around you is thinking. And so
or maybe gay. I don't know.
Or that. Yeah. I mean, it could be either way, like something next to murder, borderline murderer, no matter what. And so, you find like really good reasons to not make it to, sacrament meeting. That's because right. Like it's humiliating. And not only that, but, all of my siblings, I think they probably got married around my mid-20s, like all within a few years of each other. And I wasn't able to attend any of their weddings. And,
because in Mormonism,
if you don't have, a current valid temple recommend, if your siblings are getting married in the temple,
even if you're a parent.
Yeah. Even if you're a parent, I mean, for at least, I guess it's probably all of them actually, but the only reason I hesitate is I don't remember if my grandmother came to all of them, but so my mom's mom, who's, died a Methodist, she, I sat outside the temple with grandma and like the children and like a couple of cousins with tattoos, whenever anybody got married, and everybody knew why I was out there. It wasn't because like I didn't believe in the church. It was because I was unworthy to be in there. And so, not only like am I this huge disappointment or feeling like a huge disappointment to my siblings that like, sorry, I couldn't, be good enough for like a short amount of time. Like I couldn't try hard enough to be able to make it to like the most important day of your life.
Yeah. Right.
But just also assuming like my parents have to be so disappointed, and again, underlying all of that is like, like I'm kind of blowing the whole miracle.
Wow. That's hard. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I didn't love that, that era.
I can see why.
So yeah, I guess by the time, Prop 8 rolled around, I was pretty primed to have like the full shelf crash, just because try as I might, like I just never was able to I think probably after maybe 3 years, I don't think I ever was able to get another temple recommend. Like I would get close sometimes and then slip up and then start the whole process back over.
You were on like a decade-long shame parade, basically.
It's so exhausting. Yeah. That is so exhausting.
And other people just lie, right?
Sure. That
so when you're honest,
didn't work for me.
Yeah.
Well, and I remember at one point I had like a really lovely bishop who, he was really understanding, and like he kind of got me fast tracked through a few things, and I got really close with him. And then I ended up moving to a different ward. But I remember like one of the most frustrating experiences that I had with a bishop, and I think this was about the last time that I tried, was this bishop at a BYU ward, and I was working with him on some chastity issues, and like I was really like struggling with my testimony at this time. I was like barely, I could barely convince myself to go to church. I was working at Macaroni Grill, and so I often worked Sundays, and so I also, like, my ward met in the afternoon, and so most of the, like, if I had to work a Sunday, I couldn't even make it to church. And there was another ward that I'd previously been in that I had some friends in, and I felt actually kind of motivated to go there. And so I went to this bishop. I was like, hey, like, I'm like hanging by a thread here. I have no motivation to come to this ward, because it was, again, like just an uncomfy BYU ward with a lot of young people. This other ward was like just older people who felt more my age, and just, and I was like, I do feel motivated to go to this other ward. It meets at 9 a.m. So even on days where I have to work, like I can still go to church, and, and I will continue to meet with you, but if I can just attend this other ward, if you need the other bishop to verify with you that I'm going, like that's totally fine. And he was just like, this is where your records are. This is where you need to come. Like, of course, if, on a day where you have to work, like if you need to go to the other ward on that day, that's okay. But this is where you need to be. And I was just like, okay. And never went to see him again. But
yeah.
What had kind of, I guess, preceded that a little bit was, so as I mentioned, I'd gotten a job at Macaroni Grill, and ended up working with 3 gay men who were basically as far as I had known, they were the first gay men that I'd ever known. So turns out they were the first open gay men that I'd ever become friends with. But, over the course of like 7-8 months, my whole kind of life, or my whole worldview, just kind of flipped. Cause, previous to that, I'd grown up in a homophobic culture, and, I think the quickest way out of ignorance or bigotry is to get to know somebody about whom you feel bigotry or are ignorant. And so,
hey, Kyle, did you have any clue about Kyle?
No, yeah, no idea. Like never would have guessed that. He did a remarkable job at just burying that as deep as he could, and hiding it.
Turned it off.
Yeah, I mean, it's found the box and crushed it. But yeah, so I realized, like, oh, like gay people are people too, and they're not everything that like I was taught to believe, and And I remember, so recently I was going through some old journals of mine, and I'd found this journal entry that I'd written. It was kind of late 2007, and I'd gone bowling or gone, maybe it was like Fat Cats or something in Provo, but gone there with some friends from Macaroni Grill, including one of the gay men that I'd become pretty close friends with, and I was just kind of reflecting in my journal, like, I just, like, this guy, he's such an awesome person, like, just a great dude. And it's just unfortunate that, like, he has this, like, horrible test, that, like, God has given. Because at that time, the church almost kind of presented, like, well, like, having homosexual thoughts, like, it's just a test, it's like any other temptation that a person might have. And so that's how I thought of it. And I was just like, I just hope that, Heavenly Father is, like, merciful to him and is, like, understanding, because that seems like it would be a really hard test. And so, it wasn't too many months after that, Proposition 8 in California, the proposition that was trying to overturn the legality of same-sex marriage was launched, and that the Mormon Church was a huge financial and manpower contributor to.
The biggest.
Yeah.
From a totally different state, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so,
from Utah, marshaling all its money
right.
and human resources to defeat legislation or to take away same-sex marriage from Californians,
Yeah. And so at that time I was just like, how are we telling, not just people who aren't part of our religion, but people in another state who aren't part of our religion, like, how are we telling them that they can't marry who they love? And for the first time, like, something about the church just felt deeply wrong to me. And I felt like the leaders are not right on this. And I thought to my friends that I worked with, I was like, why can't they marry who they want to, who they love? Like, that is their right. And so once I questioned one thing, then, all of the other things that I'd always just kind of put on the shelf, the priesthood and temple ban, polygamy, a handful of other things, just issues with the Book of Mormon. That's when I started to think about those things and was like, well, if they're wrong about, this, then, like, maybe they were wrong about some of those other things. And so that kind of started a year and a half, maybe 2 years of just, like, drifting further and further away from the church. But, like, also just so much, like, studying and pondering and just trying to find something to hold on to. Like, I remember, like, I grew up literally believing that the earth was 6,000 years old. And so I remember thinking once, like, well, how on earth does anything fit within a 6,000 year timeline? Like, how are there fossils? Like, how are there all these things? And so I remember one day I was thinking, like, okay, maybe, like, what if like, when, the Lord was, like, creating all the things, and he started like the world process going, and, things were, like, living and existing and dying up until like evolution was happening, and like, evolution happened until, like, right at the point where, like, man was ready to be man, and then he blocked off, like, the Garden of Eden, stuck Adam in there, and then, like, and that's what started things. So, like, that would account for, like, fossils and fossil fuels and, like, all of the clear evidence that death happened, long before 6,000 years ago. And I remember one day I was on the phone with my dad. It's like, what about this idea? Like, just trying to like grasp at straws. And he's like, that's not what the scriptures teach. That's not what the prophets teach. And I was like, okay. And so it just felt like everywhere where I was trying to kind of grasp at anything, that it was just kind of getting shut down. And not that like had, my dad been like, oh yeah, maybe that could be that, like that would have, shifted me much, but it's just kind of more along the lines of just how much more quickly like orthodox approaches just ended up pushing me out.
Right.
So yeah, I'd already kind of become less active. And so once I, was pretty much not believing in the church any longer, I tried to mostly hide that from my parents. Like for a long time, like I really avoided just spending any kind of alone time with my dad. 'Cause like, there were a few times during the period where like my siblings were kind of getting married, where like, he'd catch me off guard and just be like, so, how's your repentance coming along? And which there's like not a worse question to come from a parent. So any parents out there, avoid that question.
Not a winner.
Yeah, it is the furthest thing from a winner.
Yeah.
But so I just like always avoided any kind of alone time because what that question or questions like that did was just like reignite all of that shame. Mm-hmm. And so, what I, underlying all of this is, kind of this whole idea of like, again, I'm throwing away my birthright. I'm forsaking or like ruining, this elaborate plan to have like landed me in the family, like the forever family that I'm in. And I'm losing that. Which now shifted to like, once I really stopped believing, then it just turned into a lot of shame around like, I've like tarnished this miracle for my family. Like I've kind of destroyed this, I'm like destroying this like really special thing for them. So, and it was interesting to me, like once, much later finding out, as my bio mom had mentioned in that section that I read earlier, that she always, felt like faith came so much easier to her siblings and not so much for her. And I found myself at that time often feeling the same way. Like, why are my siblings all, why is it so easy for them to be faithful and to like believe in all of this and to like walk stay on the path? Maybe it is because like they were born of goodly parents and I wasn't.
Ouch.
So that other or different came later. Remember how I was asking that in kind of your childhood or teen? Mm-hmm. So it's interesting where if it did, I don't know that you'd talk about it that way, but it seems a little bit more like you're suffering and as you've struggled and then you do that compare thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It is interesting because, my whole growing up life, I didn't really experience that until I left the church. And that's when it felt like the most pronounced and the most prominent. And,
I think it's also interesting, this is complicated, so I'm not going to try and make it overly simple. But I do think it's interesting sometimes, we look at specialness or like this story that, was part of your origin, and that you were special, that like a miracle happened to kind of usher and I think, there can be a really natural reaction to that of like, how beautiful, how amazing. And I think, what happens so often with preferential treatment, special stories, people being kind of, more favored. And I'm not saying you were, but with many of those kind of scenarios, they play out with a bit of a shadow side to it that oftentimes we don't see in the beginning, but oftentimes when you follow the story through, it's so much to hold though.
It's like Buddhism says golden chains are still chains.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, it sets you up for a huge crash.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because you're super special, but then unworthy all the time.
But
super special, constantly unworthy.
And inevitably, we're all human.
Yeah.
And we're also special, but we're human. And so when you're in touch with your human side and what we don't know and what we haven't experienced yet, right? Then inevitably, So just feeling for that for you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I guess like the ultimate end to the specialness was when I came out to my parents about not believing the church anymore. And I don't remember, ultimately kind of what finally led me to tell. I think I was just tired of trying to hide it and pretend like, I was still sort of believing. But I told them in like it was a 7-8 page email, and what I really wanted to convey to them was just the reasons why, and that it wasn't their fault. Like I think I even included like a brain cancer metaphor. I was just like, you guys blaming yourself for this would be no different than, if I'd ended up with brain cancer and you asking like, is there something that we did or didn't do right or could have done that would have prevented this? Like, of course not, like things like that happen. And I think that this is where I was going to arrive here regardless, at some point. And so
this was in your letter to them?
Yeah. So this is my letter to them.
This?
Yeah. And I also, I wanted them to understand that like I really did my due diligence. Like it wasn't just because, I wasn't leaving because I wanted to sin or because like church was like too hard or, all of the like really insulting reasons that people get accused of leaving over. And, but yeah, I just want them to know that like I have put a lot of thought and a lot of prayer into this. And I've gotten to a place where I don't believe it. Like I can't believe it anymore. So my mother, she responded pretty immediately and compassionately. And, she told me, we've kind of suspected that, that you were continuing to distance yourself from the church for a while. I'd also told her in the same email that I'd gotten my first tattoo, and she was like, honestly, like I'm more shocked that you got a tattoo than that you don't believe in the church anymore because I'm terrified of needles. And then so again she was kind about it, and then my father, he didn't respond for a couple of weeks, if I recall, and when he did, it was, kind of like, you've made important covenants and like you've made promises with the Lord. And, I distinctly remember the line, like you need to, shake the blood from your garments and repent. And that was not a helpful response. Yeah. It basically just, I was like, okay, well, it doesn't feel like you really read anything that I said. So, okay. And that kind of started a years long period of just always like an undercurrent of tension between us. Like, again, I would just avoid at all costs, like being alone with him, because I was just always afraid that he would bring up something about the church, and then like all the shame would come in, and I don't want to paint that to seem like, like we no longer loved and cared for each other, or like he was horrible to me. Like, I mean, in group settings, like he still treated me like the father he'd always been, like he's a wonderful father. But I just always knew that there was this like underlying like hurt and just a need to like reel me back in. And so over the course of several years, like I would think that we would get to a place where like he'd kind of accepted it. Like I remember he'd invited me on a fishing trip that he'd done the year before with his brother and some of his sons, and then my brother and some of my brothers-in-law. And so, he invited me to that, and I agreed to go, assuming that like my brother and brothers-in-law were going to come. And then I remember a couple of days before that, finding out that it was just he and I driving like all the way to Flaming Gorge together alone in a vehicle, which like this was for sure the first and longest time we'd spent alone in a few years. And so I was like, all right, well, we'll see how this goes, and drive out there. It's fine. Like it didn't ever come up. And then about 20 minutes into the drive home, I remember he said something like, so like your mom tells me that you're a secular humanist now. So like, what does that mean you believe about God? And I was like, all right, well. And so we then ended up having, about a 3-hour conversation where I just kind of told him where I was and explained how I got there. A lot of things probably that were in the original email. And it ended up being a really good conversation. I think that there was one point of like where it got contentious. It was actually right as we were about to stop at like at a gas station to refuel or something. And I was just kind of proving the point, like what sort of God would allow a third of his children to be like tortured for eternity because like they followed like Lucifer's plan. Like either to me, like they didn't have the full story or the understanding of like what that choice meant, or I don't know. Like that's the only thing that makes sense. Like they could, because who would choose like, yeah, I'm going to go with like this Lucifer guy's plan. Even though I know that you're going to cast me into eternal suffering forever, worlds without end, like that's bonkers. That doesn't make any sense. And so he was like, well, like agency, like if you like, sometimes like you have to let your children make their own choices. I was like, that's bad parenting. Like if your toddler is running towards like the edge of a cliff, you're not going to be like, oh, agency, like, or you'd be a bad parent. Like, the toddler doesn't know what it means to run off the cliff. And clearly like the third of souls that were cast into eternal suffering, like they couldn't have known what that meant, And at that point we parked and I got out of the car, and then we just kind of like reset and recalibrated and didn't return to that subject. But I remember by the time I got home, I was like, okay, I think this was actually a really good conversation. I feel like he actually fully understands where I'm at. And so I think, for the period of like a year or so after that, I felt like I could act like really authentically around him, and just felt like the elephant that had previously been in the room was, like finally put down.
And this is over years. Like this is a process with him.
Yeah, this
right?
was a long process.
Which is good for, I think, people to kind of hear.
Oh, absolutely.
A bit, yeah.
Yeah. So sometime, like maybe a year or so after that, I'd been at home and I think it was for his birthday maybe. And as I was driving back to, my home in Salt Lake, I was just feeling a lot of gratitude for him. And so I'd sent him a text and was just like, hey, I just want you to know, like, I love and appreciate you. And it means the world to me that, you love me for who I am and accept me for who I am. And he didn't respond for about a week. And a week later, I was at a restaurant with some friends and we were in the line to pay, and I got a text from him and he said, I've been thinking a lot about what you said. I do love you, but I'm disheartened or disappointed by your choice to turn away from God. Life's short. What then? And that kind of like flipped a rage switch for me. Mostly just like under the rage was just a lot of hurt and shame.
The words "I love you, but" just don't belong together.
Yeah, just never include the but.
Never a great setup. Also, I could imagine you maybe feeling, tell me if this is right, but like really having a hang in there. And then the trajectory seems to be moving in a certain direction. So maybe also you were starting to have some hope. And then you get the text where you're like, okay, I guess not.
Yeah,
what?
I mean, I thought I was beyond hope. Like, I was like, no, we're good.
I think
like,
we're good.
He gets it. He understands where I'm at. Like, it's like we don't have to go through that stuff anymore. And so it was also really crushing in that way. I was just like, I thought that we
real
past this. And so I wrote another long email and, just again, tried to explain this is why I'm here. This is why I don't believe. And then, and I'd like told, like, my mom knew I was upset and so she was kind of trying to act as like a mediator. And at the end of that, like he ended up responding like, I get it. I'm sorry. Like, we'll stop doing that. And I was like, okay, we're good. And so a year or two later, like, I think it was around the springtime, I got he sent me a talk from, I think, President Nelson that didn't love it. It was like it was a pretty shamey. It was a talk he gave, I think, the year before COVID ruined everyone's lives, and it was just kind of like, to me, it felt like it was placing a lot of pressure on parents and loved ones of wayward children, and to do something. And so I ended up writing like a kind of a paragraph by paragraph response to it, in part trying to illustrate like why this is not helpful to send me, and like why this is actually infuriating and like
hurts your relationship. Yeah.
And I don't know why you would send me this thinking like this might warm me towards the church, because it's having the opposite effect. But I ended up not, like, by the time I finished it, like some of my ire had passed, and I just was like, I'm not going to send that. And so, went on from there. But so I do.
So there are these blips. That's what I'm hearing a little bit, right? Is you kind of go along and along and along, and then there's like a blip with an article, or is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that. And I do need to backtrack a tiny bit because there was something I left out that's important before this. But so in 2015, when the church released rolled out the policy that said that the children of gay couples no longer could get baptized.
The November exclusion policy.
Yeah, that kind of just flipped a flipped another rage switch for me. And
it was 2019 for those who.
Oh yeah, 2019. Okay,
yeah.
so this is the same.
Like November of 2019.
Okay, no, yeah, oh yeah. In my brain, it was 15.
15 was.
What was 15?
Sorry. 15 was the policy. 19 was
they
the
reversed it. That's
reversal
right.
of the policy.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's good to get my timeline straight. But yeah, I was so angry, angry about that because like by this point, I was long past the my homophobic roots and very much saw myself as like a staunch ally to the LGBTQ community. I had lots of friends, part of the community, and so I was pretty enraged that like, I don't care about people being in the church. Like if people want to be or don't want to be, that's fine to me. But like, it just felt so horrendously cruel to, both the children and the parents, and just the fact that it wasn't even just saying like, oh, they shouldn't be baptized, but it was like, unless you denounce your parents' relationship, like you can't be baptized. And like, that just felt, it was violent. It felt monstrous. Mm-hmm. Yes. So one night I was out drinking with some friends and just bar hopping, and we ended up at beer bar, and there was a table that was like, hey, resign. We're signing up people to resign for the church. If you want, just put your name and number down. And I was like, absolutely. And I just like carved my name into it. And then kind of totally forgot about it for a few weeks. And then I get this letter in the mail from them. And I remember like when I got it, I was like, oh shit, like, did that work? And because it like suddenly came back to me what I'd done a couple of weeks previously, and so opened it up, and sure enough, like there it was. It was, and it felt like such a bizarrely anticlimactic moment for something that was like,
has eternal ramifications, right?
Yeah,
this idea.
It was this thing that was like, next to like murdering a human, like this was the worst thing that you could do. Mm-hmm. would be to like renounce your membership to the church. And I'd like literally forsaken my birthright. I'd canceled every ordinance, and all I got was this like bland letter saying like, Brother Fish, like per your request, your name has been, and records have been removed from the church. If you ever want to undo that, your local bishop will help you. Good luck. And I remember just like kind of sitting there in silence, feeling like, oh, that's it. Okay. And, I didn't have this like crushing sense of like, like the world is ending and I've made like the most eternally consequential choice ever. It was just like, oh, I guess they just undid my name. So later that, do either of you know when tithing settlement occurs?
It's usually
end
December.
of the year, November,
okay.
December.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So yeah, that.
And it's worth noting that when you show up for tithing settlement as an adult, it's this paper that says how much money you've given the church in the year. And the bishop asks you, is this a full tithe? Meaning, did you pay a full 10% of your annual income to the church? And inexplicably, the church has always included the names of the children of record on the tithing settlement slip. Yeah. So it's this weird way that if an adult child resigns from the church, the faithful parents are notified because all of a sudden one of their children isn't listed on their tithing settlement slip. And I don't know if that's intentional or not, but that's the effect. So,
it leads to like an element of like surveillance
and of a lack of privacy,
and lack
right?
of privacy. Yeah.
Because some people just want to resign, but want to do it privately. They resign because they don't want either their name associated with the church, or they don't want the church bothering them by sending people to bug them. But they don't necessarily want their parents to know because it might break their parents' heart. Yeah. But it turns out there's no privacy in the Mormon Church in that way.
Yeah, which this was news to me.
Oh, ouch.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% assumed that like they'll know about it if I tell them, or I don't know. I guess like if I assume maybe there's like a way that if they had a suspicion that maybe I'd done that they could call and ask and figure it out. But I just assumed that they wouldn't know, much less that they would know, within like a week or two of.
Does that surprise you, John? That they knew it that quickly?
No, that's the way the church works. And I think they keep it there to make people not want to resign.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that makes sense to me now that, because had I known that, I don't think that I would have, which I'll get into that in a little bit, but so I'd gone home for Christmas, and there at some point I was talking to my brother, and he told me like, oh, by the way, like mom and dad know that you had your name removed, and I was like, oh, okay. How did they, like, why do they know that? And he's like, they found out a tithing settlement, and I, pretty immediately had this just kind of like deep feeling of shame in that moment. And I was just like, well, how'd they take it? And, he was like, oh, they were pretty sad, but, and so, I just felt pretty terrible. And I believe it was that same Christmas that my mother gave us, each of the kids, like these kind of big binders with, like lots of our important growing up papers, like had our, mine had stuff related to my adoption. I think all the original letters that, my bio parents had given me, but in it also was, I think, included the certificate of my sealing. And I remember in that moment, when I saw that, I sat there and just was so full of shame. Like I don't know that I've felt that same level of shame. And I just,
'cause why?
Well, so all I could picture in that moment was, I was just imagining like this scene where like my parents are, like they're dressed in white, they're carrying little me into the temple. They're, they put me on some sort of altar, and then they have me sealed to them. And just knowing like everything that I knew about my story and how I came to be with them, how desperately they wanted a family and wanted me. And they had this like beautiful memory of taking me and sealing me to them after this like long road, and just feeling like I had completely shattered that memory for them and probably turned it into something deeply, deeply painful. And I remember just like, I just lay in my bed with my partner and I just sobbed, and sobbed. And any time after that for quite some time, like anytime I would think about, having left the church, like that I can't call it a memory because like it wasn't a memory because it was an infant and didn't remember that, but that kind of vision, that scene would just pop into my head, and it would just feel like the most inconsiderate piece of shit. And honestly, like I think of all of the things like related to leaving the church, I think that's probably my biggest regret. 'Cause so many times I've just felt like who cares if your stupid name is on the rolls? Like, why did you have to be this like petty drunken asshole that like, wanted to prove some kind of a point? And, at what cost did you prove that point? And that cost wasn't worth it. That's working through that shame and working on that memory is like, that's what I had to do. Like that was like the most therapeutic work that I needed to do related to any of this, was just working through the shame of that memory, which I was able to do, which is good. So I guess I think the following Christmas, my then partner, now wife, she'd been wanting us to do 23andMe for a while, just to like figure out, like what terrible cancers await us, and like just to get a sense of, like, are there health things that we need to worry about? And so my mother, so that's what she, like, my mom always asks, like, what do you guys want for Christmas? And since we didn't probably need another Instant Pot, she got us the 23andMe. And as part of this, I remember thinking like, and I think actually, now that I think about it, a few times my mom, in years previous to this, had been like, you should like try, do 23andMe or ancestry.com or something, because like maybe that's a way to find your birth mom. Because, I'm going to backtrack a tiny bit. So I think it was probably around like 2014, I thought I found my bio dad. So I'd like, my mom had been in Relief Society telling my story, and a woman in her ward had gone up to her after and just been like, hey, I think I know who that professor was, because I think I was his TA. Like, I was a TA for a guy. It was right about that same time. And
oh, wow.
Yeah. And like, I remember it seemed like there was some kind of controversy, and then he was just gone like the next year. And so I was like, all right, yeah, that's probably Papa. And so my mom was able to get the name from him. And so I looked up, so I ended up doing some like Google searching for him, and I found a picture and this like real estate profile in like Colorado Springs, I think. And the picture, like when I saw the picture, I was like, that has to be my dad, because he looks like what I think I would look like when I'm like 50, 55. Like, it just felt like we have the same like eyes, nose, like this region seems the same. And except for he had a cowboy hat on, but I was like, but that would be me with a cowboy hat when I'm 50.
And was it the same person?
It was a different person from Yearbook Guy.
From Yearbook Guy.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And so in this profile, it said like, I'm a former college music professor turned real estate agent. Mm-hmm. And then when I like looked up, he was in, like, records had him in Cedar City in 1982. And so I was like, if it's not him, like, this is the most absurd coincidence. And so like, I crafted a very careful email and was just like, hey, first of all, I want to preface this by saying, like, I'm not after anything. I'm not looking for anything. I'm just curious. But did you by chance happen to place a kid for adoption like 34 years ago or whatever it was, in Cedar City? And here's why I think like you or him. The literal only reason why I want to, because I just want to figure out who she is. And, you know, if you don't, like, if that's all I could get from you, like, you just give me a name, I'm satisfied. I don't need anything else. I'm not looking for a dad, like, not looking for family. I just want to try to find her. And he responded, was like, hi, thanks for reaching out. Not who you think I am. I'm actually, like, I've been a Christ follower my whole life, and I was married at the time and would not have done what you say, but I'd heard, like, I was brought in to replace, like, the predecessor who seemed like had some kind of scandal happen, and so sorry, good luck. And I 100% thought he was lying. I was like, no, he's for sure my dad. Like, the coincidences are too wild. And so yeah, got denied there, felt a little sad about that, but I was like, oh shit, like that, there goes my one chance to possibly find her. So anyways, back to spitting in a tube. So my mom got us ancestry.com for Christmas, spat in the tube, sent it away. And then like six weeks later, get the results, and just had like a ton of matches. And so I looked at some of the ones that were like the highest matches. And from what just based upon what I'd read, I assumed that they were like probably cousins. And so wrote them an email and was just like, hey, I know this might be weird, but did by chance you have an aunt that maybe like 36.5-ish years ago happened to place a baby for adoption? Would be neat to know. Thanks. And I also, I tried to also be like, I'm not, I don't want anything that, like, I don't want to make anything weird for anybody. And I'm not, trying to, like, I don't want to cause her any problems because like, I didn't know who even knew about any of this, but I assumed that like, it wasn't like a huge complete secret, but I don't know, who knows. But so I tried to be like really sensitive in how I asked. And then not long after sending that, I read a little bit more about what the results looked like and realized like, oh, that's actually probably an aunt and an uncle that I sent that to, not a cousin. And sure enough, like, I think maybe within a day or two, I got an email back from one of the women that I'd sent it to. And she just said, hi, Andrew, I'm your aunt. Your mother is my oldest sister.
Wow.
And just like that, I was no longer biologically untethered to this world.
Amazing. That is amazing.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
It was just such a surreal moment because, I mean, just days before, weeks before, I had been fully in the camp of like, never going to get to figure out who she is. And then suddenly, like, I found her sister. And so finding, having that avenue was kind of a really cool relief, but then it also came with like just a really intense pang of fear because, for so much of my life, I was adopted quite possibly because my mother needed to be brought back to the church. And so what if that worked? And like, what if she was, what if she was an active member and then, and Waltz's 36-year-old name removed from the records, me, and does she then regret placing me? Does she, does she judge my parents? And so that was, I think my biggest fear is, I just didn't know what to expect. And, in looking at, like, as I was getting some of these, these matches, I did some like Facebook stalking and looked real clear that they were, probably Mormons. And so, it seemed like at least her family was, still Mormons. And so, after my aunt responded, I kind of reached out to her and I was like, so my biggest fear is, I just kind of expressed what I was worried about, and it told her, like, I don't want her, if she is still a member, to think that, like, that my parents did anything wrong, that, like, that it had anything to do with them. Like, I was raised in, like, the Mormon ad poster family, and, like, they did everything right. And, this was an inevitability that I was going to get to regardless of who raised me. And so, her, when she responded back, she was like, fear not, your mom is basically like you are. She's the oldest, and she's the only one of our siblings who is not part of the church. And, so fear not. And I think that was, like, one of the most significant reliefs of my life, was just knowing that, like, I wasn't going to disappoint one more person and hurt another person. And that, like, I don't know, maybe there is, like, the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Like, if she's the oldest sibling and she's the only one that left, and so am I, like, I guess it was a biological inevitability.
It could be validating.
It was incredibly validating. Yeah, it was very, very validating. So I, with my fear assuaged, I decided to, try to craft the email that, if I had placed a human for adoption and discovered their existence for the first time 36 and a half years later, that maybe, like, I would want to get. And if it's okay, I'd like to share a little bit of what I wrote to her in that first email. So the subject line was just, "Hi, birth mom?" ? with birth in parentheses. So I said, I guess maybe I'll approach this from the mindset of, if I had birthed a human 36 years ago and never had a clue what became of it thereafter, what would I want to know? And I then went on to just explain how incredibly lucky I felt, and kind of just gave a brief, history of, just like what had happened after they adopted me. But I said, in referring to my parents, they talked about you a lot. I never remember a specific moment in which I learned that I was adopted. I just always knew. They treated my adoption like it was something special, like a miracle, in fact, as 3.5 years later, my mother's womb apparently reversed its barren disposition, or my dad's swimmers got better at swimming, and they popped out 3 natural kiddos within about a 5-year span. Nothing changed about how my parents treated me, and to my siblings, I may as well have slid from my mother's womb the same as they. All in all, every one of them really nailed the whole how to have an adopted child / sibling and not mentally and emotionally ruin them. And then I went on to say, I guess maybe the greatest gift I can give you is the comfort and surety that you did the right thing. I was cared for, loved, and much of the good in me I owe to the examples of my parents. I also don't know that you could ever quite comprehend the gratitude that my parents have for you
and what you gave to them. They've always honored you and did their best to do right by your priceless gift. So I then explained, how I'd left the church, how I told my parents, and, my eventual fear and reaching out to her that, she was still Mormon, and that, what that might mean for her discovering that I wasn't, and then told her a bit about myself and my partner, my dog children, my career path, my love of the outdoors, cooking, traveling, just other essential pieces of who I am. But that more or less I'd overall enjoyed a happy and lovely life. And then before asking some questions of my own, I wrapped up by saying, I hope all this wasn't terribly overwhelming, especially since I decided to just be pretty candid and avoid sounding like or presenting myself in a way that I'm not. Also, obviously, this is a new situation for me, as I've never previously contacted a birth mother for the first time, so I don't exactly know what the protocol is. So we then communicated back and forth and just kind of sharing some of the different details of our lives. I also, was able to connect her with my mother, and so they corresponded a little bit. And if it's okay, I'd like to share a couple of snippets of what they said. Sorry. So this was from my bio mom to my mother. She said, "So this is the second letter I've written you. And I wish it had not have had to been 36 years between the two. But thanks to DNA technology that regular folks have access to, we will finally get the opportunity to meet. Something I truly thought would never happen. I want to thank you and Wayne." My dad's name's Wayne. My mother's name's Debbie. "I want to thank you and Wayne, very strangely, the first name of Andrew's half-brother's father, for turning out to have been even beyond the people I had hoped for to raise Andrew. His strong character comes from who you both are, clearly people with the depth of character that helped him to be that amazing and wonderful person that he is. My only regret is that I did not know all these years what a beautiful life he was blessed with because of you. I look forward to sitting in the same room and hearing more of his life and the lives of those most dear to him." And then she shared some logistics about, when they would be able to possibly meet. And then she said, please let me know what your thoughts are. I look forward to a very special and unique meeting and giving you the long hug I've been saving. I look forward to giving you the long hug I've been saving for our boy's cherished mother.
I love that.
Yeah. So my mother's response, she said, "I've thought of you countless times, especially on his birthdays, wishing that I had a way to communicate with you to let you know how he was doing and what a great boy/young man he was growing into. Several years ago, I think it was while he was getting close to the end of his mission, I suggested to him that he might want to investigate an adoption registry I had heard about to see if he could make a connection with you that way. But I guess life got in the way and he never pursued it. I was hopeful that the DNA kit we got for him for Christmas might help him find you. I was thrilled when he told me it did. He shared with us your emails to him, and when I read that you said you weren't able to even hold him after his birth, it just broke my heart. I can't imagine all you went through placing him for adoption, but we are all eternally grateful for your decision to do so. I so look forward to meeting you and giving you the long hug. Giving you the long hug that I've been saving for the woman that started our family. Sorry. Any questions?
Goodness.
It's a lot. So it was about a month after, after we, after first reaching out that I got to meet her. And, so, I mean, one of the really cool things about her and about the whole process was she was so gracious and concerned about me and how any of this would feel for me. And so, when we talked about meeting, she, wanted to do it on my terms. And, so I suggested, I invited her over for dinner. I was like, I'll cook for you if you're open to coming here. And so, with a very familiar punctuality, she arrived 3 minutes early and, knocked on the door. And so when she came in, luckily, like, I have two dogs who are kind of assholes, and like they were just very, 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 very nosy and just kind of all up in her business. And so it kind of like almost created just a, I don't know, like a moment of, I guess, rather than just like opening the door
And having an
and
intense,
there she is, and having this like intense moment of like, okay, well, I guess we do this.
It's like distraction a little bit, or
yeah, it created like some distraction, a little bit of levity, and then once the dogs chilled out, gave each other a hug, and it's a really strange thing to. It's really bizarre to be a 36-year-old human and hug the person that gave birth to you for the first time. Mm-hmm. And, to stand there and what would like, for most people feel like an overly like long time to hug, especially for the first time, but to have it feel like the most natural thing in the world. Mm-hmm. Just months before this, like we both, kind of believed that it was something that would never happen. And then, all of a sudden, like there we were sharing the hug that, I think she's long deserved for 36 years. Mm-hmm. So then we spent the next like 3 or 4 hours, just kind of sharing pieces of our lives. We both share an irrational fear of bugs. Both have experienced a lot of heartache over the way that, religious institutions and our own religious institution treated LGBTQ people. And for both of us, that was something that ended up torpedoing our faith. Mm-hmm. Like we're both really methodical decision makers, and often about really stupid things like meals. both of us tend to ask really just exhaustive questions of our servers, and just want to feel really settled and comfortable that we've chosen the right meal. She was an English teacher turned school psychologist, and I was a school social studies teacher turned therapist. Well, right as I was meeting her, I'd signed up for therapy school.
Okay.
But like the way that we, graded papers and essays was like both with like kind of the same meticulous nature, got kind of exhausted and burned out by the same types of things, in the education world. And, I have both her extreme wordiness when it comes to writing and her eyes.
I'm hearing like not just parallels, but like a sense of recognition. You recognize yourself in her.
Yeah. So much of what I kind of was able to discover about her just helped me make sense of me. It felt like it validated and answered some of those questions of like, especially that came up for me in my later years. Like, why did my apple fall a little bit further from the tree than like, my siblings' apples when we were all raised by the same tree, and apparently like foreordained to be together. But yeah, just, especially the fact that, she also was not a member of the church, didn't believe in the church. I think she's still on record, but, and that, was basically her only sibling to land there, that also felt very, very validating, and, did a lot to, I think, relieve some of the guilt and shame that I've felt around that. So one moment during our conversation that really struck me was, it was just in, I don't even remember what she was talking about, but at some point she just said, when I gave birth to you, and then she kind of like trailed off and paused and was just like, well, that's a sentence that I've never gotten to say to you or with you in the room. And at the same time, like it occurred to me in that moment that like, I'd never heard anyone say that either. Like if, I think it seems like such a thing that people sort of take for granted, that like, assuming that like they're living with their biological parents, that, their mom would be like, yeah, like when I gave birth to you, or like your birth was really hard, whatever a person might say, but just realizing like, oh, that's a completely novel thing for me. Was just kind of a cool, kind of a cool moment. But so she was there about 4.5 hours, and, so she has a partner that she's been with for quite a few years, and he's really wonderful. And he basically like parked nearby for the entire like 4.5 hours. Oh. Initially I think she'd asked him if he wanted to be a part of it, and he'd just declined. So I don't want to like impact your dynamic. I want like, this is your moment. And, and I don't want, like, cause he's also like a very like gregarious and talkative person. He's like, I don't want to take anything away from that. But just the fact that, he basically sat out there the entire time in case it was awkward, or in case we were mean, she said. And I immediately loved him for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the things that was also
kind of strange about the whole experience was I'd never considered how my half siblings had been impacted by it, and one of the kind of heartbreaking pieces to the story that I eventually learned was how, like heartbroken these two little boys had been when like their mom gave away their baby brother. And I guess like, I just think there's so many aspects to any adoption story that, you don't think about or you wouldn't imagine until until they're made clear. But one of so at the as our first night ended, we embraced for the second time, and she said, "Thank you for finding me." And I said, "Thank you for literally everything. Thank you for giving me a wonderful life." And that's genuinely how I feel about it. Like I'm so simultaneously lucky to have to have been created by this person, and so incredibly lucky that she had the strength to give me away, and then so incredibly lucky that she gave me to the parents that she gave me to. I mean, I know she didn't like handpick them, but and my mom would believe that the Lord handpicked them, and I love that she believes that. I don't know what I believe. I just know that I think I ended up where I was supposed to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it seems like I got there in the way that I was supposed to get there.
Yeah.
So maybe, I guess everything kind of felt like it came full circle at our wedding last June. So my partner and I got married. We got married in Boulder, Utah. It's one of our favorite kind of desert spaces. And I got to invite, I invited both my bio mom and my parents and my siblings, and kept it really small. No children were allowed. But that was the first time that my parents met her, and also met all of my partner's parents, which she has a lot of parents. And so it was kind of this just big, wild moment where so many stories just kind of converged and came together. But and I wish I like remembered and knew and was able to pay a whole lot of attention to like when my mom and she first met. It was kind of like the first night when everybody was arriving, and so it was a little bit hectic. But I remember they hugged, and then they kind of sat down and talked with one another, and seemed like they had a nice time. Mm-hmm. But so the day that we actually got married that evening, we had a dinner and invited a handful of people to give toasts, and so I got to hear toasts from both my mom and my bio mom, and it just felt like kind of the most incredible turn of events that I don't think I could have ever imagined. Just getting to have both of these incredible women speak at my wedding. In fact, like so we got married out on this kind of like this point that had this like big vista. It was out like far in the desert on this dirt road. And so we kind of made this like little like makeshift aisle
sort of, and mostly people were just standing on either side. But so I got to have like both of my moms like walk me down the aisle, which just felt like such a beautiful, beautiful moment. But yeah, just having both of them walk me down the aisle and getting to hear both of them speak at my wedding, and knowing that there was no jealousy or insecurity experienced by either of them, that they both just, they both just loved me and they loved us. And I don't know, it was just something that I never could have imagined. And I guess the other piece too is, and I guess maybe it kind of wraps up, part of like my father's and my storyline or story arc, I guess. So after the last time that, I sent one more scathing email about like, you've got to stop like bringing these things up. Again, I thought we were in a good place, and but he ended up, so like they went on a mission in right as COVID was starting, and he'd given me a thumb drive with like a video on it, and it was kind of like we had a Last Supper at Rodizio Grill, which is
nice, very
quintessentially Mormon, I think, and
lots of meat.
Yeah, lots of meat. And when he gave it to me, I just kind of had this like sinking feeling that maybe, I don't know, I was just worried about what was on it, and it was kind of just wanted to challenge me to read the Book of Mormon and try to approach it with an open mind, and so it was pretty hurtful in that moment, just because I'd 100% thought like we were past this, we were done with it. And so it was at that moment that I resurrected the email that I'd written about the Elder Nelson article that he'd sent me the spring previous, and then just kind of really said everything that was on my mind about the church. And I mean, in the past, I'd kind of refrained from attacking much, but at this point I was like, I have to like he has to understand why there is zero chance that I'm coming back. And so, I picked apart everything about Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon, the historicity, like all of those things. And I was like, you are more likely, like the probability of you becoming like a Bernie bro is more likely than me coming back to the church. And like, my dad's very, very like conservative, and
he's like, so there's a chance?
Well, that was the one thing that I knew he'd be like, oh yeah. Cause I mean, he'd see a Bernie bro as like a full on like socialist or communist. And that's like the furthest thing that he could ever be. So I was like, that is what he will get. And I, at that point, I'd kind of also set a boundary. Like, I was like, look, this can't keep happening, because it just rips open such a painful wound every time. And so we can either have like a loving relationship with the time that we have here on this earth, and you can stop doing that, or like we're not going to have that kind of a relationship, because I can't keep experiencing this and feeling this. And it was then that I think he fully understood. And something that it also kind of helped, I think it was right around that time. Are you all familiar with StoryCorps? Mm-hmm. So I got the idea that I wanted to do a StoryCorps interview with him. And so I kind of geared it around what me leaving the church was like for him, and like what his experience was around that, which
that's nice.
Yeah. I mean, I felt like I, had a sense of what that meant, but it ended up being a really beautiful experience. And, we both shed a lot of tears, but what I came away from that understanding was that for him, it really was it was just fear. He was so afraid that like I was lost and am lost. And I'm the only one of my siblings who is lost to him forever, that what else could he do?
It's a unfortunate false scarcity model that Mormonism creates, because you talk to other Christians, they're like, of course we're all together in heaven.
Right.
And Mormonism's like, you can be together forever with your family if all of you are faithful Mormons.
Yeah.
So he's been conditioned with a false scarcity model, basically.
Right. And that really actually softened a lot of my like hurt and kind of anger at those moments when he would reach out, because I realized like
It's his worldview.
Yeah, it's not. If anything, that just shifted some of that anger at the institution that taught him that, and that creates that unnecessary pain that I know that he feels. But
he's just being logically consistent.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he's nothing if not incredibly consistent in his, like his beliefs and his approach to the church.
Why wouldn't he try everything?
Right. And
forever.
And I think it was only once, I really, really made clear that like what you were asking me to do is impossible. Because I think like that's one of the hard things about the church is that, there's no such thing as impossible. Like there is some like right thing you can say or just right way you can testify that will like, pierce the veil of darkness or the, pry the scales from my eyes, like whatever it is, like, so.
And it's your responsibility as a parent to do it. It's on you. That's part of the conditioning.
Yeah. And so, and my hope was, I think what ultimately happened was, by making it 100% clear that there's no chance that I hope that alleviated him from that. But
which I love that you did that for you.
Healthy boundaries.
Because I think it's both. You can acknowledge and understand where your parent is coming from.
Right.
And also be able to advocate for what you need or what type of relationship you're going to want that's good for your mental health. Like,
Well, and it was, since kind of that point, like our relationship has been really wonderful. And, we do have a very loving relationship, and I don't feel judged. I don't feel afraid of spending time alone with him, worrying that he's going to bring up something that I've set boundaries around. And, kind of the part of the culminating moment of that for me was at our wedding when, that was the kind of the first time that I, was my full kind of unfiltered self. Like I felt comfortable being that. Like I wasn't, I felt like I didn't feel like I had to try to tone myself.
Or filter yourself.
Yeah, filter, tone myself down. And, I remember when we were standing there getting married and, I'm just a handful of times, like I looked at my parents and just being able to see like happiness and joy on their faces in a situation that like I grew up most of my life seeing as having like a at the very least like a serious undertone of sadness too. Cause like I remember growing up like hearing my parents say things like, like there's just something that's like a little bit sad about like going to, a wedding at like a church or just somewhere else because it's, you just know that like they're not together forever and it's,
Oh, right.
Although she wasn't married in a temple, right?
Well,
at first.
Well, eventually she was, but yeah.
But yeah, like and so I've just, that was always something that felt sad about my future prospect at some point. Like if I ever did get married, that like, could my parents feel joy there, because it's not a temple marriage. And that wasn't that and there wasn't a single moment throughout that I felt any kind of like an undercurrent of like sadness or disappointment. Like they just seemed genuinely joyful for me and for Sam. And all of that was an experience I never fathomed that I would get to have with my parents.
So life surprised you in a good way.
I mean, life delighted me in such, I could never have fathomed, 6-7 years ago, having the wedding that I had with my parents there, and my father in particular, and not having a single worry about like, is he uncomfortable? Is he upset? Is he disappointed? But just feeling loved by them. And maybe that's part of like the overarching message. Like I hope that anybody that listens to this gets is if you are questioning your faith, or if you have left and you are going through that fear and that sadness around like, will my parents ever come around? Maybe they won't. But even if it feels like it's impossible, like you can't fathom that they will understand, or that you can get to that place, you might be able to get there. It's not hopeless. It's no guarantee, but again, I never would have fathomed my parents getting to kind of where they are.
We're so happy for you.
It is a cool story.
Thank you. I guess to maybe kind of wrap up, while the church gave me a lot of pain, and it's caused a lot of what feels like very unnecessary anguish in my life. It also gave me the family that I have. If my bio mom hadn't made the decision that she made, she made the decision she did because of the church, because she believed that she was prompted to do that. And, my parents adopted through the church. They were trying to have a forever family. And, so because of that, I've gotten to have the life that I have. And it's funny when if I look at my patriarchal blessing now, I can actually see things that are true in it. One of the things that it said is, Brother Fish, may you always choose the right, and may you stand tall for that which you know is right and good. You are blessed, Brother Fish, with the gift of righteous judgment. You have the gift of judgment to know right from wrong and good from evil. And, speaking up for the things that matter to me, for what I believe is true, has always been a value of mine. And, based on like, once the church no longer felt right and good to me, I couldn't do any other thing but follow that truth wherever it went. And so, in kind of a weird paradoxical way, like my patriarchal blessing almost predicted the fact that eventually, like I would have to leave. But maybe funniest of all is, it wasn't until I'd left the church and kind of left behind like all of the different, arbitrary metrics for what what it means to be good, or for someone to be born of goodly parents, that the goodly parents line no longer bothered me from that. And, being conceived out of wedlock, under the conditions that I was, no longer had any bearing upon whether or not my bio parents were good people. What I've come to know is that, the woman who gave me up is the absolute definition and example of a goodly parent, which is also, I think, paradoxical in and of itself, that being the goodly parent can be literally giving up your child.
Mm-hmm.
But being selfless and compassionate, kind, empathetic, moral, ethical. I was born of one goodly parent and then given to two other goodly parents. And I don't know that I could be more lucky. Jesus Christ, amen.
It's beautiful.
Beautiful. Any interest in a relationship with your bio dad at all, or not? Or
I would be interested in just knowing about him and finding out what his life has been like and what he's done with it. And, I, not in the way that I care about and have an interest in, having a connection to my bio mom. If I were able to find him and he, wanted to meet and, have a beer, would love to do that, but I don't need another dad. My dad is plenty in the best way. But I'll take more moms.
Hey, wait. No, I'm just kidding.
Not to rag on dads, but mom's just, there's something special about them.
What a beautiful story.
Thank you.
You did it, Andrew. You just laid it bare today.
Thanks.
Thank you.
It was my honor to get to share it. And I wish that she could have been here to speak to her side. Because she's much more articulate than I am, and is just such a brilliant human being. But
yeah.
Well, huge thanks to you, Andrew, for being willing to share your story. I'm sure it's going to mean a lot to a lot of people.
Yeah.
Huge thanks to all three of your parents for the roles they played in that amazing story. And thanks to you, Margie, for being here today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Making these interviews better. Thanks to Kyle Ashworth for making this happen. Did you just call him Ashworth? He called you Fish. Did you call him Ashworth?
No, we actually called him Garlic.
Oh.
Which it was such a stupid reason. There was some other kid that lived in Nephi years before him. His name was Sam Garlic, and my friends thought he looked like that Sam Garlic, so we all just called him Garlic.
That's awesome.
I feel like this is how nicknames can go sometimes.
Yeah.
I was called Potty because John was another name for a toilet. So in elementary school, I was called Potty. So.
Yep, that sounds about right for elementary school.
Right. That's right.
Anyway, thanks, Kyle. Check out Latter Gay Stories if you want. It's a great podcast. Also just thanks to Julia and Gerardo and Maven and Brooklyn and all those at the Open Stories Foundation, including my board, that make all this possible. Thanks to the donors that make all this possible. Again, we couldn't do it without you donors. And if you value this content and you're not a donor, but you want to see more content like this, or you're grateful for the content and want to pay it forward, you can go to mormonstories.org, click on that donate button, and become a monthly donor. Then we'll keep providing this type of content to you. If you don't want the commercials on YouTube, just buy a YouTube premium account, $10 a month. They take out the ads. And of course, you can always subscribe to us on YouTube, please. It helps with the algorithms. And you can check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok as well. And Yeah, and then there's a really good process now for applying to be on Mormon Stories. We're always looking for cool stories. You can go to our website at mormonstories.org and apply to be on the show, and we'll review your application. We can't accept all, obviously, but we'd love to. If you're interested in throwing your hat in the ring, we'd love to review your application. We're always doing panels. We're always looking for cool stories. So check that out if you want to come on the show. Anything else, Margie?
I think you nailed it.
All right. Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks so much.
All right. Email us at mormonstories@gmail.com if you have feedback or thoughts. And mostly be good to each other and be kind to each other. And we'll see you all again soon on another episode of Mormon Stories Podcast. Take care.